Hey everybody, welcome to Quality Time with Koala Bear. Today is July 27th, 2020. This is going to be episode 6. We're going to talk about Christopher Columbus. Not all sinner, not all saint. So here we go. All the mayhem of the violent protests and the pressures to take down a large amount of statues across the United States, from Christopher Columbus, Civil War icons, and oddly enough, even slave abolitionists, all go back to the fairly recent hatred of Christopher Columbus being taught to younger generations, primarily through Howard Zinn's a book called A People's History of the United States. This is something that has become in fashion over the last, say, 20 years in colleges and in high schools. This is what's being taught in most classrooms about American history. A lot of the older text, even going back 150 years ago, are just no longer being taught. It's really kind of sad, but this is kind of the state we're in. So it's taken some time to build up steam, but there's an incredible amount of hatred for Christopher Columbus, and there's a lot of myths out there, a lot of misunderstandings of history. So we're going to tackle this today because I think the tearing down of the statues really comes from a misunderstanding, a complete lack of being properly educated about the history of Christopher Columbus. This is a lack of interest. What's going on is a lack of interest in researching, analyzing, teaching, and discussing thoroughly history, world history, American history, etc. And history is no longer attractive to a lot of people, but what is attractive is tearing down history. We see this with Antifa. We see this just a whole bunch of common people being interviewed on the news, and they just think, yeah, we need to tear it down because it's it no longer represents us. Well, it should represent us because it's our history. The good, the bad, and the ugly, the miracles and the massacres. So we need to get educated, so that's what we're going to do right now. Before we get into Christopher Columbus, we have to establish a frame of reference along a timeline in order to put Columbus in context of world events. So the 1400s is what we're talking about here, and the 1400s is actually the 15th century. Okay, the 1400s is the 15th century. And that's from 1401 to 1500. So some notable points within that 100-year timeline is you've got Joan of Arc, you've got the invention of the printing press, you've got the War of the Roses in England, you have Leonardo da Vinci, the Ottoman Turks mass their empire, the Russian Orthodox Church splits with with Rome. China begins exploring Africa, and the Aztecs dominate the Mexican lands. They consolidate their power during this 100-year period. In that 100-year period, here comes, within the second half of that century, Christopher Columbus, who lived from 1451 to 1506. Remember, he died in 1506, and that's important. If you were to listen to various videos and read Wikipedia and the first several entries in Google about Christopher Columbus, you're going to come away with complete negativity about this guy. Case in point, there's a popular video going around on YouTube, been around out there for a while now, from the Young Turks, and using writers from the Huffington Post to just completely destroy Christopher Columbus. And this is a good example of how people have really perverted accurate history to fit a narrative that the Western civilization, is evil, wrong, white people are wrong, Europeans are wrong, everybody's wrong except their narrative, their point of view. And you just see this on and on and on from the people that produce the videos from the Young Turks. So I thought they were interesting at one point, but then the more that I watched them over the years, the more I realized that these are just complete knuckleheads who hate Western civilization. It's just the way it is. I don't know why, but they're just hateful people. If you're going to offer up a way to look at Christopher Columbus, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer up a way to look at him through personal dogged research, analysis, logical reasoning, and to put it in context. I'm going to take out the feelings and look at history for what it actually is and for what it was. You know, ever since Marco Polo traveled the Asian Silk Road, as they called it, in the late 1200s, which was the 13th century, Europeans have been looking for a faster way to Asia and India. And by the mid-1400s, the monarchs in Europe were financing exploration by ships across the ocean to find a quicker route to Asia. So they were coming out of the Dark Ages, out of the Middle Ages, they're coming into the Renaissance period, and so they were looking to build empires, to expand empires, and the dominant blocking of the Europeans was the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so they were really thorn in the side to the Western Europeans at that particular time. So they had to figure out a different way of exploring and getting to Asia. We can take a brief sideline here just for a second. At about 1000 AD, we've got a Viking called Leif Erikson, who actually you could make a case that he's the actual first European who discovered America, if you're talking about European and so forth. But even that's a little bit of a misnomer, because he landed in North America, or Newfoundland, what we call Newfoundland, Canada today, from Greenland, where he had a couple of settlements there. So these are the Norsemen from the Norwegian countries that came across to Greenland, had settlements in Greenland. Then they kept pushing to Newfoundland. This is where they were at. They were there for 1 year, decided this isn't really a hospitable place, and they left and they never came back. And it was almost lost to history because people actually forgot about this due to the Black Plague in Europe at that time. So you could make a small case that Leif Erikson of the Vikings was the first European to discover, but the fact of the matter is they never really did anything with it, and they just never returned. So that's not 100% accurate either, but it is an interesting sideline. So we're going to use, before we get into this, what I want to do is I want to use 5 explorers of the time, and also butt them up against 5 tech giants of today, because it's important to put things in context. And as I've said before in previous videos, the most important word in the English language is context. All right, so we got to put it in context here. So the 5 that I picked out here, and there's a whole bunch more, but I'm going to pick the 5 here in each time period. So number 1, we've got Christopher Colombo. Okay, so we know him in the English as Christopher Columbus, but his actual Italian name was Cristoforo Colombo. He was an Italian explorer, and he sailed for Spain in 1492. The second one was John Cabot. He was an Italian. His Italian name was Giovanni Caboto. He sailed from England and to Newfoundland in 1497. Okay, so you got 1492, you got 1497, John Cabot. 3 was Vasco da Gama. He was a Portuguese explorer, sailed from Africa to India, ended up there in 1497. Then you had Amerigo Vespucci. Amerigo Vespucci, he was an Italian explorer. He was the first European to realize that the new lands where he ended up was a new continent, and it was in Asia. And he actually ended up in South America, around Brazil, in the mouth of the Amazon River, South America there. So the North and South America was actually named after him. Now, Vespucci was a little bit of a kind of a shady character, in the sense that he kind of made up some of his stories. Some of his stories were disproven, but he actually was an explorer of that time, actually did make it to the mouth of the Amazon, and so the continents later on were actually named after him. The 5th one is Ferdinand Magellan. Okay, he was a Portuguese explorer from Spain. He wanted to sail to find a passage to the Spice Islands in Asia. He ended up sailing around South America into a new body of water that went on and on and on, and he named it the Pacifico, or the Pacific Ocean. He himself made it as far as the Philippines before he was killed by the natives there. Out of several hundred men on the ships that he had, only 12 of them made it back. They ended up being the first to circumvent the globe. So they went to around South America, to the Philippines, Asia, India, Africa, and back to Spain. So those are the 5, okay? You've got Christopher Columbus, John Cabot, Vasco da Gama, and Amerigo Vespucci, and Ferdinand Magellan. Now, I want to butt those up against 5 modern tech explorers, okay? Because, again, we're using context here. Number 1, I'm going to choose Steve Jobs of Apple. I'm going to choose Bill Gates of Microsoft, Jeff Bezos of Amazon, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, and Elon Musk of Tesla. The reason I'm doing that is because these are aggressive guys in their time period that pursued technology, and they were just as aggressive as the other 5 that I just mentioned. And it's important that that as the human race evolves, as we change and technology changes and things move on, that there are people in history that are very aggressive. So before we start demonizing people too much, we really need to take into account just what were they trying to accomplish, okay? And we know that the 5 in the modern era were trying to accomplish things in technology and science that had never been done before, and now we actually take it for granted because we're using it every single day. We want to also briefly just bring up Giovanni Verrazzano. He was an Italian explorer for France. He actually was the first European to actually create a settlement. In 1524, he landed at Cape Fear, North Carolina, and then traveled up the coast to New York. And then in 1528, sad case of event, he was eaten by cannibals in the Caribbean islands. So Giovanni da Verrazzano really didn't make it too far, but he did. We do have records that he was the first European, other than Leif Erikson, to make it to the mainland of North America. All right, so people know. People knew in the 1400s that the world was actually round. It's kind of a misnomer to say that, well, it was common knowledge that the world was flat. Well, no, it wasn't, because they had figured out the world was actually round a long time before, but they just didn't really know the actual size of the globe. So they had globes. They were rare in the 1400s, and the maps that covered these globes, okay, were oriented with the east at the top of the map, okay? It wasn't until later that they figured out with the North Star and all this other stuff. But in the beginning, as they were trying to figure this stuff out, they put the east at the top, okay? And this is where this thing talks about Christopher Columbus was looking for a protuberance. Well, there's a particular map here that at the top of this particular map, there is a protuberance, because that was the paradise that they were looking for. So the best cartographer in that time was Toscanini, and in 1474 there was a map used by Columbus, and because Toscanini was the best cartographer of his era, and he had the best maps out there. And so Toscanini wrote to Columbus, claiming he would certainly make it to Asia, because they thought Asia was much larger, thus shorter time to travel on the seas. Charles Mann is a contemporary writer who articulates that educated people knew the circumference of the earth. Well, and that Columbus didn't, right? And that Columbus was kind of a buffoon. Well, the problem is that they didn't calculate. Well, they did calculate the circumference of the earth. They just didn't know that the Earth was actually bigger than what it was. And what Charles Mann doesn't understand, or doesn't really put in his writings, is that Tuscaloosa and Columbus communicated quite a bit before he left on his voyage in 1492. But there's no way to know for sure until further exploration was going to be done. Okay, so and so what he's doing is he's just dumbing down Tuscaloosa and Columbus to fit his narrative using today's standards instead of the standards back then, and actually instead of actually using the data people had in the 1400s. Columbus was aiming for Cipango, which is the word that they used for Japan at the time. All right, and he actually ended up on the island of Hispaniola. Now that was they didn't have a name for that until they named it. Okay, so as he traveled, so by today's measurement, he was off by 7,000 miles from Japan. But at the time, they didn't, and that's what these maps are there to illustrate. The third voyage, Columbus landed in 1498, and he landed what we call Colombia in South America. But at the time, well, he called the area Paria, and there was the Bay of Paria, and then he named that land Paria, and that was his protuberance. Okay, on that third voyage, he thought, okay, we finally found it. This is the protuberance. This is the promised land. This is the area that we're looking for. Well, he had no way of knowing that that he was wrong. Okay, because this had never been done before in human history. And educated people still weren't sure if Asia and America were connected or not. And this is where Amerigo Vespucci comes in, because Amerigo Vespucci realized, he was the first European at that time to write down, hey, this is not the Orient. This is not what we think it is. This is actually a brand new continent. So the map in 1507 by Waldesee Mueller took a while to figure this out. And then also you got this map in 1587, the Mercator map. So what they understood was changing. It took a while for them to figure this whole thing out. We knew that the Earth was round. We thought it was this. We thought it was this amount of mileage or the distance, and they were completely wrong. So a lot of times we're judging on today's standards, which we should go back and understand of their standards back then, because we're also judging things today upon what we know today. But say 200 years from now, they may be laughing at us and going, those silly guys. Well, see, this is where things get really skewed in history. So Europeans had been living close together with animals, with domesticated animals, and they built up immunity to different diseases. But on Columbus's second voyage, this is where smallpox wipes out 90% of the natives that they encountered, and the natives had no previous exposure to these things. And sometimes in these writings that modern historians bring up, they'll say that they had smallpox blanket. Well, that didn't happen until the 1700s. So we're talking about 1490 to 1498 to 1502. Okay, so they're way off base on some of those things that they're talking about. But yes, European diseases wiped out about 90% of the natives that they encountered, because they just had no way to combat this stuff. They had no immunity whatsoever. It wasn't planned. This happens in human history, just like the Black Plague in Europe. About the time when Leif Erikson was crossing the Atlantic, the Black Plague was going on, wiped out about 30 to 40% of the European population. They had never seen anything like that before, and it killed a lot of people. More men were sent to set up the settlements on the second voyage and in the third voyage, and Columbus left some of those people there to govern those lands, to govern the people, They wanted to put them in subjugation, not slavery, because what was going on is that they claimed it for Spain, and because Spain was a feudal system, just like all of Europe, this was about putting people in subjugation. So yes, they really didn't have a choice, but it wasn't necessarily slavery as we know it today. Okay, so none of Columbus's original journals that he wrote actually survived, because a lot of people say, well, Columbus wrote in his journals. Well, yeah, he wrote in his journals, but we've got no hard evidence. We've got no carbon-14 dating of these things. We've got no actual proof that they existed. But here's what we do have, and this is how we base our judgments. His journals were transcribed by Bartolomé de las Casas in 1530. Okay, now remember I said that Columbus died in 1506. Okay, his journals were not transcribed into another language, or were not copied until 1530. Okay, so, and de las Casas wrote this stuff down. Okay, now he transcribed them, so we have to go off of his transcriptions, and in those transcriptions, October 11th, 1492, there's a passage that says that the people are ingenious and would be good servants. Okay, now the word servants is often taken out of context as slavery, and depending upon how you slice the wording in the transcriptions of that, you could say it's slavery. But in those days, the word servants, okay, was meant to be subject of the crown. All right, this is a very common thing that was written down, a servant of the crown. All right, so the Italian translation doesn't have the word servant. Okay, that's not a word in the Italian translation. Rather, it's the servant of God. So the word Christini, which is C-R-I-S-T-I-A-N, C-R-I-S-T-I-A-N-I, Christini means Christian. Okay, so in the transcription of that, in the translation in Italian, that's what it means. But again, we don't actually have, none of the historians today have the actual journals in the writing of Christopher Columbus. Okay, it's akin to the lost manuscripts from Alexandria, Egypt. All right, they're lost to history. Nobody really knows. So we're going off of a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation. So de las Casas was traveling with Nicholas Ovando, all right, in 1502. Now this is important. All right, now Nicholas de Casas set up an encomida. Now encomida is a Spanish feudal system. He set that up in Central America and within Central, Northern South America and in the Caribbean islands. Okay, there was a feudal system of lords and peasants, and the natives were to be subjugated as peasants, not slaves, as peasants. Okay, this was a very common practice. It doesn't make it right, but it is exactly what these people did. So de las Casas was the actual transcriber in 1530, but he was not with Columbus. It was de las Casas' father that was with Christopher Columbus. But de las Casas himself traveled with Nicholas Ovando. Now this is important because it was in 1500 that Columbus was taken back in chains back to Spain for cutting off the hands not of the natives but of the Spaniards who were not obeying the Spanish law and were also abusing the natives. He did kill some of the natives, but he wasn't committing genocide upon them. So he went back there to stand trial and was in jail for 6 weeks. And while he was in jail in 1500, Christopher Columbus is in jail in Spain, wrote letters to the nurse of Spain, the nurse of the Spanish Prince John. Now, Prince John of Spain had died, and so we have letters to the nurse. I don't know if it's an actual medical nurse or not. The best I could see is to this particular person. In there, he's talking about Nicholas Davando. He started the Atlantic slave trade, and that he was committing genocide upon the natives. He was brutal to them, and that was not right. That what the intent was to make them subjects of the crown of Spain. All right, and from the recommendation of Bartolome de las Casas, as he ended the feudal system there in the Caribbean islands, Central America and South America, he ended that because he realized that these people were not going to be easy subjects of that, and realized that it would be better to take people from Africa, and because Africa had more plentiful natives, therefore, hence the slave trade. All right, so there's where the Atlantic slave trade comes in, not from Christopher Columbus, but as the recommendation from de las Casas to Nicholas Davando, who actually was the barbarous slave trader and mass murderer. Okay, not Columbus. So you got to dig into history to find this stuff, because it's there, but pop culture doesn't want to dig that far. So de Davando came after Christopher Columbus. He wasn't there with Christopher Columbus. He didn't come before. He came after. Okay, and de Davando brutalized the Tano people. And the English historians used a propaganda campaign. In England, the English people used a propaganda campaign called Black Legend to discredit Spain. So these countries were kind of warring with each other and trying to one-up each other and to create bigger empires. So there was a whole lot of mess going on there. De las Casas, as I said, de las Casas transcribed the Columbia's journals in 1530. And it wasn't until 1892 that the first English translation of de las Casas transcribed Columbus journals was done by a man by the name of Charles Kendall Adams. Okay, and the originals were written. The original, meaning Columbus's original journals, were written 40 years prior to de las Casas. All right, so these are all third-person accounts in every translation that's been handed down. All right, and anytime you do a third-person translation, things get skewed. So the real historical events, we have some truths, but we also have some things that are just fabrication. All right. So people like Howard Zinn and Charles Mann, they leave out the cannibalism of the Carib natives, and the Carib natives were in Central and South America, and the Caribbean islands. So, and then also the Aztecs had very common human sacrifices. So they leave all that stuff out and say, no, these were more peaceful people. Well, the Tano people were peaceful, but you had the Carib. There was very different tribes throughout, and they were warring with each other, enslaving each other, eating each other. It was a vicious, vicious thing. And this is very foreign to even Christopher Columbus. So yeah, he killed some of these people, but the idea was to turn them into subjects of Spain and to make them Christians. Okay, that was what they were doing. Foolish as it may be, that's what they were doing. Okay, at this point, we're going to bring in a video clip from Joe Rogan's podcast 1159 back in 2018 with guest astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Okay. Okay, I think him coming to America was the most significant thing to ever happen in our species.
Whoa.
Silence. I think it was the most significant event to happen in our species.
Kind of amazing when you stop and think about the fact that at that point in time, other than the Native Americans who lived here, who were living a nomadic tribal existence, very few people that had the wheel, that had firearms, that had all these things that had already been achieved in the rest of the world, had made their way to this place.
So now watch. Okay. Here's how it worked.
Right.
So you're going to hear. So I presume that you have some skepticism of this claim, as most people would, especially the Columbus haters who are out there. All right.
I don't really have any skepticism about it, to be honest with you. It makes
Okay,
sense.
so let me describe to you why I think this is true.
Okay.
And then you can tell me whether you agree or not. All right. We are hunter-gatherers. We haven't settled down yet, early humans. And we're basically wandering. We're following the herds. All right. And then the Ice Age hits. Well, what is an Ice Age? An Ice Age means it is so cold that when the moisture evaporates from the oceans, goes to the clouds go over the land, it doesn't rain, it snows. And the snow falls, and then it stays. So the water that had lifted up from the ocean does not return to the ocean. It accumulates on the land. And this accumulation, when it's significant and sustained, we call glaciers. Glaciers is not itself a snowfall. It is compressed snow that's basically changed state into this ice river that flows very slowly back to the ocean. But the oceans are getting drained faster than they're getting replenished. So during the Ice Age, the ocean levels dropped, exposing the Bering Strait land bridge between Asia and what is now Alaska, basically North America. Our ancestors who come out of Africa go into Europe. Some stayed, others kept wandering. Some stayed low above the Mediterranean, others went high. They populate Asia. They keep walking because there's a land bridge there. They don't even know it's a bridge, it's just more land. So they walk, and they enter North America. And from there, that's kind of the only way you can go is south at that point. The weather gets a little better. The Ice Age ends. The glaciers melt back into the oceans. The ocean levels rise, closing the land bridge, stranding a branch of the human species for 10,000 years. Those humans who made it across that land bridge and spread out into North America, Central America, South America, have only a few families as their parent genetic, genetic origin. Okay? It's like, some research says it's like 8 family lineages populated the entire North and South American continents. Wow. Then the land bridge breaks. Now you have Europe, Asia, Africa, and North and South America, and they know nothing of one another. 2 separate branches of the human species. The Vikings notwithstanding, maybe they came over, they didn't. Even if they did, their influence was near zero relative to the Europeans. So we're talking about influence here. This is a branch. Had this continued, this is how you speciate. This is why the species on Australia, that's why you have mammals there that have pouches. All right? No other mammals do that. They split off and they evolved their own way. Okay. So 10,000 years is not enough to grow 3 heads or, 12 fingers. But our species is separate. Now, Columbus crosses the Atlantic, makes contact with humans. This is the first time that has happened in 10,000 years. We have rejoined 2 branches of the human species. We are now one common genetic group. And that genetic crossbreeding now continues to this day. We fly to any corner of the world and mate, okay? And the mating already began immediately. Yes, there were diseases that Columbus brought to North America, much written about that. Less written is that he brought syphilis back to Europe. First cases of syphilis of 1492.
Whoa.
And then it skyrocketed.
They got syphilis from the Native Americans?
Yes.
What, did they have no problem with it?
Well, I don't know the details of how the physiology of the natives dealt with that, or whether it mutated. I don't. And there may be people who know that. I'm not among them.
That's fascinating.
But just look at the graph of reported syphilis cases in Europe. It all began in 1492 when he came back.
Whoa.
So what I'm saying is, this was a hugely significant event, the rejoining of the branches of the human species.
Well, yeah, no, I would imagine that makes sense. That is the most important event then.
And by the way, Native Americans, this infamous problem with metabolizing alcohol, okay, with Native Americans. You know who else has that problem? The Chinese.
They do?
Yes.
Really?
Yes. Yes.
So it's an Asian issue.
Well, so who stayed in so you look at who populated North and South America after before the land bridge. It's whoever was right at the edge of Asia.
Right.
Then the land bridges. So Asians and North American and the natives of North and South America have more in common with each other because of this than most other pairs of groups you might grab around the world. But my point is, obviously, there's a lot to blame Columbus for, but he just happened to be the guy who did it first. Europe was coming to the New World no matter what. Everybody was trying to find a faster trade route to the Indies. And so if it wasn't Columbus, it would have been Arnold Schmednick, whatever. It doesn't matter. Somebody did that. And the rest is, as they say, history.
Wow.
So personally, I think it is the most significant thing to happen in our species. Otherwise, we'd still be two stranded branches of humans.
It would be fascinating, though, like Australia is stranded, to see what would happen if this has gone on for hundreds of thousands of years.
If 100,000, that would have been a different story, right?
Yeah.
And your immunities would be different.
Up to is that Hernan Cortez, he committed more atrocities upon the Aztec people, with the Spanish conquistadors when they came over. They committed tremendous amount of atrocities. And yet, we don't vilify Cortez. Francisco Pizarro, and same thing in South America and Peru, slaughtered the Incas. And the culture of Central and South America is Spanish, from the Spanish conquistadors. And yet, we're not vilifying them. But we'll vilify Christopher Columbus. And the reason for that, I think, really comes down to is that it tends to be human nature that we want to pick somebody in history to say, you did this, you did that, including the Native Americans that were here. And the fact of the matter is that history is a lot more complex and a lot more layered than just some simple blaming that person right there. So, thanks for listening. Let's remember that Christopher Columbus should not be torn down. But I also want to bring up that even today, that America is named after America Vespucci, but we have Columbia, which is a feminine name for Columbus, and used like naming a ship and a woman in the painting of the Manifest Destiny. That woman who's kind of floating in the air, that is Columbia. Some case in point, there's Washington, D.C., Washington District of Columbia, okay, named after Columbus. You've got Columbus, Ohio, Columbus, South Carolina. You've got British Columbia. You got the country of Columbia, South America. You got the Columbia River, okay, in the Pacific Northwest, where I live. You have CBS Television and Radio was named the Columbia Broadcasting System. As I said before, the Manifest Destiny, a painting of the woman, is Columbia. There are 54 counties in the United States named Columbus or Columbia. And then, of course, you have Columbia University. So look, Christopher Columbus is an important figure in European history, and it does bridge the people from one area of the planet with another area of the planet that did not have any communication. That's why Christopher Columbus is important, because he was that first European to open the door so that all the other Europeans could come. He was the first person. It could have been anybody else. So just remember that Christopher Columbus is not all sinner, and not All Saint. And if we were to change the October 12th, Christopher Columbus Day, if we were, I think we ought to leave it alone. But if we were, I think what would be fitting would be to name it National Explorers Day, because they're explorers from all walks of life over the course of human history, going back thousands of years, and even our exploration in space. So if as a society we are going to say we're not going to celebrate Christopher Columbus, well, Christopher Columbus was a fearless explorer, and there were so many others, which is why I brought the comparison between the 5 explorers in the 1400s and the 5 tech people of the 20th, 21st century. Exploration of any group is how the human race survives. With that being said, have a great day. God bless America. Love you. Take care.